A budget is telling your money where to go instead of wondering where it went. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. We meet again on Monday at 9:30 p.m. right here on TV1. Our discussion today revolves around Budget 2018. Will Budget 2018 at least make you rich this time around, or is it just mere words? The good, the bad, and the worst. To discuss Budget 2018, we have invited 5 eminent personalities to the studios this evening. Joining us this evening is Shiran Fernando, Chief Economist, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Nice to have you on board again, Shiran, on the show. Also joining us this evening for the first time is Charmaine Tilkaratne, Director, Tax Services, PwC. Nice to have you on board as well, Charmaine. No stranger to Face the Nation, Dr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, joins us this evening as well. Also joining us this evening is Mr. Rajendra Thiagaraja, Chairman, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, also is a veteran banker. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Thiagaraja, this evening. Also joining us this evening is the very interesting Dumindu Hulangama, Ernst & Young, Sri Lanka. He's a partner. Nice to have you on board again, Dumindu. We, of course, will be discussing about taxes, the reflections that it's going to have on your pocket. And at the end of the day, will Budget 2018 at least make you rich? So let's start off tonight's discussion with Dr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Dr. Vijayawardena, many view Budget 2018 as a progressive one. Not much pomp and pageantry. There was no magic wand this time on the hands of Minister Mangala Samaraveera, as we witnessed with in the past with former Minister of Finance Ravi Karunaika. What do you gather from Budget 2018? Where are we really heading in the next 12 months, starting January 1st, 2018? Your time starts now.
Shamir, now when you compare the budget presented by Minister Mangala Samaraveera with the 2 budgets presented by his predecessor, Minister Ravi Karunaika, you are correct that it's actually a way forward. Overall, I find that the budget has a lot of promise, and he had done a beautiful job of presenting the budget in a very professional manner in Parliament. And you would have noted when he was reading the budget, he was very confident in what he was reading, and we didn't feel that he was reading something that had been prepared by someone else for him, because it came out of him. And he used the minimum time to castigate the previous regime, also to praise the achievements which this government has made. Then the whole of the period he used for presenting the budget, which was based on 2 basic themes. The theme number 1 is that he wanted to introduce a system called Blue-Green Economy for Sri Lanka, and the other one is the Enterprise Sri Lanka. And both are novel experiences for Sri Lanka, and the main thrust of the budget that he had presented was not to appease the ordinary people, ordinary public, but to introduce the necessary economic reforms which are needed by the government today to take Sri Lanka to the higher level of economic development which the government is planning to attain over the next 30-year period. So the budget has been a midway financial plan which will get itself connected to the future budgets that are to be submitted by the government, as well as the future economic plans of the government. And of course, we have to be mindful of the fact that the present government has Vision 2025, and the government would be able to implement Vision 2025 only if it gets re-elected in year 2020.
Dr. Vijayawardena, I want to interrupt you for a second here, because you on this very show, when Vision 2025 was launched, you on this very show said, this is just a collection of numbers. All this,
collection of wishes. Collection of wishes.
Collection of wishes.
Yeah.
Whether it's possible is a very big question mark. Budget 2018, is it a reflection of Vision 2025?
No, budget, Samir, would lay foundation for the government to attain some of the targets of Vision 2025, because the budget has emphasized on the need for introducing economy-wide economic reforms. And at the same time, the government wants to consolidate the budget picture in Sri Lanka, increase the revenue level and also to reduce the deficit in the budget. And then the budget 2018 has laid foundation to attain these long-term objectives. So in that sense, I might say that the budget 2018 has been a way forward for Sri Lanka overall, but of course there are lots of deficiencies, weaknesses, because you talk about the good, the bad and the worst. So I might say it has lot of goods but lesser amount of bads and the worst that we may be able to discuss over the period.
Of course. Thank you very much, Dr. W. Jayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He's been very vocal on this show, so we are looking forward to discussing more about the worst, the good and also the bad. My next speaker this evening is going to be Duminda Hulangama, Ernst & Young Sri Lanka partner. Duminda, a couple of months ago on this very show you said the government has to relook at its tax regime, there has to be a proper system, there needs to be a proper mechanism in place, all that and more. And now, Budget 2018, do you think your aspiration somewhat has been fulfilled when you heard the speech made by Minister Mangala Samaraweera in Parliament? Your time starts now.
Yes. So I made that comment, I think, subsequent to the last budget. Because the last budget and the one before, those 2 years were fairly turbulent in terms of the tax reforms. So I think in the last budget the tax reforms were proposed, and between that and now, if you take the principle of the Inland Revenue Act, they introduced a new act replacing the existing act. So to that extent the reform on income tax took place. So there was no requirement to make any amendments to the Inland Revenue Act or to income tax in this budget. In fact, that was the proposal we made to the Honourable Minister as a launch chamber when we went, said that we have already gone through a change in the law, so therefore don't change the income tax act at the moment. Keep it at least for 2-3 years to give the level of consistency that people and the business community requires, which I think he did. So therefore we are very grateful to him for that. With regard to the VAT, I mean, if you take the principal taxes I'm talking on, the VAT also, there was no rate increase, because that was something that we suggested not to increase the rate because we have gone through rate increase already. Don't make dynamic changes to the law. If you want to tinker around it, yes, it is okay. To bring more goods and services into the net is what we suggested, so that you can have, so you increase your base, you widen your net, widen your base, and therefore 15% can be maintained for some time, I think, which also they have done this time. If you look at a lot of the exemptions have been removed on certain goods. At the same time, services like condominium property have been brought back into the liable list. So, so for VAT also, without making a very fundamental change, they have been able to increase the basket of goods that be liable to the VAT. So I think with that, the level of consistency has been maintained for VAT as well. So the principal taxes, VAT and income tax, have not been meddled on much, which is very good. The one that really, the two new taxes that will be introduced, I mean, we have always been telling the government not to introduce these what you call nuisance taxes, for example.
And they've done it again?
Yes, so this time they have introduced what was proposed last time was not implemented. Last time it was called the financial transaction levy. This time it has been reworded as a debt recovery levy. So whatever the purpose which the money is being raised for, it is a tax on the banking system, on the financial service industry. So it's we don't know how the tax will work, but 20 cents per thousand, 10,000, right? Yeah. So it's worked to 0.002.
1,000 rupees.
That's right. It works to 0.002% on all transactions. What I understand from what I got information is on all transactions. Then the telecommunications levy that have been imposed on all towers. Now those are going to be very significant taxes in terms of the institutions, because those institutions have to be viable in the end. So if you take off 50% of their profit, then how can they survive? How can they reinvest? Those are the issues. But at the same time, someone might say, okay, instead of that, if we increase the VAT rate, then the whole country gets affected. I mean, so it's not easy for a government to balance the budget as a, I mean, there will be people who will be happy, there will be people who are not going to be happy. It's very difficult to satisfy every person. So there will always be a situation where some are happy, some are unhappy. But I think as far as the consistency of the tax system is concerned, have been maintained or upsetting too much.
Thank you very much, Duminda Hulangamo. Right at the start, we are now getting the feel of the worst side of the budget 2018. Two new levies, the debt repayment levy as well as the telecommunications tower levy that was imposed by the government. Duminda, before I shift to Mr. Tyagaraja for his thoughts on the budget 2018, we saw a similar levy coming into play in the year 2002, the debt repayment levy. It was abolished in the year 2011 as well. So Sri Lankans have been paying this levy.
Yeah,
and why this sudden concern about the banks?
See, what was imposed in 2001 was not, it was called debit tax. So the difference between the debit tax that was imposed that time and abolished in 2011 and what was introduced now, that the debit tax was paid by all the customers, not by the banks. So it was tax on the customer on all your transactions. But this levy that is being proposed is a levy imposed on the financial institution. So in the budget speech, he says that should not be passed down to customers. But I mean,
but looking at the profits that the banks have made this year, it's quite significant, and they have to be taxed some way or the other, isn't it?
Well, that's what I said. It's difficult to make everyone happy. I mean, you have to get it from somewhere.
Thank you very much, Duminda Hulangamo, Ernst & Young, Sri Lanka. He is a partner. Now move my attention to Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Tyagaraja, nice to have you back on this show. You have not been featured on this show, but this is my second time having you on the spotlight. Several years ago, when you were the chairman of a particular commercial bank in Sri Lanka, you were very optimistic of the country's economy. And then you slid back a little bit, took a step back and said, things have to change. 2015, we saw significant change in Sri Lanka, and now you are the head of one of the biggest chambers in the country. What are your thoughts on budget 2018? Is there anything that we can gain out of it, or are we still sliding back? Your time starts now.
I think as Vijay said, Shamir, I think there are more positives than the not so positives. From a chamber perspective, a few things to highlight. The communication and the relative consistency this year, and this speech resonates with two public documents, which is the PM's 2017 statement and the Vision 25. At least we're talking this, they're more congruence than divergence. So that's a positive side. A couple of other things which were also, I think, welcome from a Sri Lanka entrepreneur or enterprise perspective is the export focusedness in terms of economic prosperity. But I think instead of leaving it to a few large companies to drive the export, this budget gives an opportunity for the entire Sri Lankan enterprise Sri Lanka, from the village unit to the medium and small and medium enterprise level to the SME sector, which is really the nucleus of Sri Lanka's business, to get into that value chain. And that's captured in what we call the Sri Lanka Enterprise Package, which we can talk later on. But I think that value chain is very, very important. So also, along with that comes, being an island, you cannot really have exports without an element of imports. So the need for trade liberalization was also been recognized, but they have built in a package of trade adjustments so that it eases out the shocks. And the other important thing was the positive thing, certainly, was the consistent amount to be pumped into education. That, I think, was also to be welcome. The only issue I had regarding that was, I only hope that given the need for entrepreneurship and employment creation, that this investment in education will be outcomes focused rather than just developing a curriculum which is not relevant to what the country wants. Right?
Mr. Tyagaraja, in terms of the negatives, I think what I really want to focus is about the two aspects that was brought forward by Duminda. the debt repayment levy as well as the taxes on the telecommunication towers. How bad is it?
So from a perspective, while you did articulate that these banks have been making money, yes, banks have been making money, but what I think the public should realize is, unlike a normal enterprise, your typical return for every 100 rupees of assets they churn is less than 2 rupees. So you would either have a humongous amount of assets to create that. That's point one. The second thing is, already these banks are taxed to the extent in excess of 40% through various sources of income and VAT. But if you look at this particular aspect of 20 rupees over the 10,000, just to put things into perspective, I think if you look at the 2016 Central Bank annual report and track the transactions, literally you're looking at about 107 trillion worth of transactions where you apply this 0.02 to bring in that 20 or 22 billion rupees per annum. The issue is, okay, for the next 3 years you churn this sort of amount, but if you look at on the other side, this 20 billion is against the cumulative post-tax generated by all the banks in that particular year, which was around 116 billion. So literally 1 in 5, 1 for every 5 rupees of after tax goes in here in terms of this. Along with an environment which says in Sri Lanka is moving into what they call the Basel III regime, where the risk-adjusted calibration of assets are going to be soaking more capital. Secondly, by 2020, there is an expectation that the minimum capital of these banks, which are currently at 10 billion, will double to 20 billion. And thirdly, for some of the accounting colleagues, you'll understand that Sri Lanka is also going to adopt an event-based provisioning regime as opposed to a time-based provisioning regime on the single largest asset class in a bank balance sheet, which is loans and deposits.
I want to make it very simple, Mr. Agaraja. If banks are making profits, why not tax them?
Fair enough, but they are already taxed. They are already taxed to the extent in indirect and direct in excess of 40 cents for every rupee. And we are also, unlike perhaps some of our regional neighbors, our capital markets have not...
Why is it bad for an economy?
In terms of this, I think one needs to balance taxing a cash cow against preserving the stability and give them the ability of plowing back, because this segment plays a major role in the economic propulsion of Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajendra Thiagaraja, Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I now move my attention to Charmaine Tilakaratne, Director Tax Services, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Charmaine, interestingly, these two taxes that I'm referring to, the debt repayment tax as well as the taxes on the telecommunication towers, right now looks as an obstacle, but in a larger perspective, there's money still coming in to the pockets of the government, and this is encouraging. And many say this is bad. You have a banker saying that, you have the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce chairman saying that, you have another tax colleague saying that as well, who's a tax expert. All this is bad, and I just don't understand why. If the money is coming into the government, why not? Why not do it?
Well, if you look at it from two sides, two perspectives. One is that from a view of the general public, I think the fear is that this tax won't be limited to the banks or to the mobile operators. It will get passed down in some form to the consumer, either through a fee adjustment or some other name. You call it another name and it will get passed down. So effectively, it's again the consumer that gets taxed. And second, what I feel is over the past budgets, focus was there was focus on trying to streamline the taxes and not increase to this indirect tax base of the new taxes. Now here we are adding on 2 more taxes again, and we take a step forward and then again we take another step back. And the third thing is the debt recovery levy. It's supposed to be temporary for a period of 3 years. But there was what we call nation building tax, which was also introduced in 2009 on a temporary basis to build the nation after the war, to help build the nation, which is still in place. And now it's sort of widened its base. Earlier it was only on manufacturing and on trading. Now it has even reached out its tentacles to the banking sector. So some of these taxes that are introduced on a temporary basis tend to permanently remain temporary. So that fear is there, and that affects the consumer.
Shaman, when you look at budget 2018, these 2 taxes that I was referring to about, why not have a profit-based tax? Why have 20 cents for 1,000 rupees? Why complicate matters? Just have a profit tax and then done and dusted. You know exactly what you're earning, and that's about it. Why not that option? Because
as Mr. Tyagaraja said, it will look like you're killing the golden goose that lays the golden eggs. I mean, already they're taxed in excess of 45 as a percentage on their margins. So it would seem unreasonable and unfair to then increase that further. So instead of bringing it as a direct tax, you bring it indirectly.
The government's view of the private sector is that they are the engine of growth. Do you think that this is reflecting as far as budget 2018 is concerned? Does it give ample opportunities for the private sector to be able to capitalize on their strengths and move forward?
Certainly. I mean, the government has proposed at least to liberalize some laws which would obviously encourage the private sector in the shipping industry. But of course, as with all of these proposals, implementation is key. And while the private sector contributes towards the growth, they face a lot of obstacles, and the more we can remove them, the more they will contribute.
Are you optimistic that all this budget proposal will be implemented? Because the 2017 budget, there are many proposals that are to be implemented even to date. 2 months more, one thing is for sure, those are not going to be implemented. 2018, good proposals, will they be implemented, or is it going to be something after 10 months we are going to say, oh no, we're not going to implement these, we'll probably do a better budget next year? What's going to be the story?
Well, I'll say this, at least I'm happy that we are able to identify who is in charge of which proposal, who is responsible for the proposals, and there is now a mechanism to track it. At least we can lay blame at the end of the year.
And the best option now is to do an appraisal, and if they don't perform, fire them. Thank you very much, Shaman Thilakaratne, Director Tax Services, PwC. I now move my attention to Shiran Fernando, Chief Economist, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. 10 months ago when he was on the show, he was very optimistic about the budget. He was optimistic the way in which the country was moving forward. 2018, we're just 2 more months to go. Are you still optimistic, Shiran, about the country's economy?
So when I came last on the show, I think it was in March. And even at that time, you and others here were quite concerned about the economy, and we were going nowhere. And if you look at since then, some of the numbers, if you look, the currency at that point, everyone was expecting it to go overshoot 160. It's only done maybe a rupee or 2 since then. It was around 151. Growth has been...
We're now standing at 155.
Yeah, that's if you look at the selling
just
rate.
5 rupees from the target rate. 2018 by the end of this year.
So if you look at the indicative rate, it's not that. But if you look at the buying and selling rate, it's what you're referring to. And if you look at interest rates, if you look at that, that has come off now. We were looking at a higher interest rate regime that has come off. We have a balance of payments surplus, 2 billion, which no one's really talking about. We have FDI, which has done much better this year, up 700 million in the first half, compared to about 200-300 million last year. So it's got better, even though the budget 2017 did not implement most of the things. We've seen what outside the budget can be done, and that's the whole Inland Revenue Act reform that has happened as well. So it's not necessarily that you need the budget to take all the reforms on board and try to figure things out for the economy, but you can do these things outside the budget and get some of these reforms done as well. So moving into 2018, I think with a better budget, which is on that fiscal consolidation path, you have better stability on the macro and the monetary side. And if the global picture stays as it has been in the last few months, for most months next year, then the economy can continue to do better.
Sriram, when you look at budget 2018, the government has focused on many key areas. There's focus on the plantation sector as well, about the tea smallholders, so on and so forth. But it does not talk about the exporters at the end of the day, who are responsible for that foreign exchange revenue coming into the country. It doesn't talk about that. It talks about liberalizing the country's economy to an extent, but not going beyond the boundaries. What does it really mean? Do you think that FDIs would come in? You say that this year was satisfactory. Next year, do you think we have certainty in the country?
So that's, I think, where we sort of go wrong and expect the budget to have everything. There are things happening outside the budget. We're having an export strategy happening. We have industries identified, work in terms of the free trade agreements, trade adjustment programs. The budget's talked about more export financing, things like that. So there are things happening outside the budget which, with this policy direction, connects them all together and helps exporters take it forward. And now we've got GSP Plus Tax also to build on. And so all these factors combined together will work. You can't just simply expect everything to be given on a platter in the budget, but all these things working together.
But Sriram, when you really look at, let's talk about the GSP Plus concession, let's talk about the garment sector in Sri Lanka. Many big players in the country are moving out. They're setting up operations in Kenya, they're setting up operations in Vietnam, and by the year 2025, you're going to have people going to these countries, and we are going to lose jobs. There is a threat.
Well, it's not
only this country's
not only garments that can do better under GSP Plus. There are other goods that we can sort of export more into these markets, which can.
But where is product diversification at the end of the day?
So that's where things like automation, transitioning, de-skilling, reskilling, those kind of factors need to come in. And this budget sort of, at least from a policy level, provides some direction for businesses that at least for the next year, there is not going to be too much of volatility.
Thank you very much, Sriram Fernando, Chief Economist, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Budget 2018, is it going to make you rich? At least the private sector in the country, which is deemed as the engine of growth so far. Let me open the floor for questions from our journalists. On to my immediate right, as always, is Nadim Majid, and on to my immediate left is attorney at law Sonali Vanigabadughe. On to my left also is Charita Fernando, and on to my far left is Ananal Jayawardhan joining us this evening for the first time. Let's start tonight's show with Charita.
Thank you, Shamil. My first question is to Dr. Wijewardena. Doctor, we've seen the introduction of a debt repayment levy, right? Do you believe that the government should focus more on their expenditure side, looking at how things could be managed better, rather than bringing in a debt repayment levy?
Charita, the rationale behind the levy is that we have 3 years, 2018, 19 and 20, in which the government has to spend a huge amount of money to service the existing debt, and it might affect the normal cash flow of the government, and therefore they want to raise money from some source. But of course the method that they have used is completely wrong, and I agree with Duminda and Mr. Tyagaraja and also Ms. Syamin. There are several problems associated with the proposal to tax the banking sector. Number one, the banks have not been defined, because today what we mean is not a commercial bank but an institution that might provide financial services, which includes even Dialog, which provides the payment system, retail payment system in the country. Second one is that the financial transactions have not been defined. I mean, financial transactions include all transactions done by these financial institutions, deposit, withdrawal of the deposits, foreign exchange payments, import-export business, payment of taxes, payment to the government, and as Mr. Tyagaraja has very correctly pointed out, that comes to trillions. The total volume per annum comes to trillions. And the most difficult problem for a bank is to identify these 20 cents and remit it to the Inland Revenue Department, because they have to change their computer system in order to keep the money, send the money. So instead of introducing that kind of indirect tax, if the government thinks that the banking sector is a worthwhile sector which should be called upon to pay more taxes when the country is in greater difficulty, they would have done it by imposing a surcharge on the profits, maybe 1% for the next 3-year period. There they would be able to very easily calculate and easily get the money.
Mr. Tyagaraja, is that something that the banking sector welcomes, a surcharge to be taxed or to be put on the profits?
I still feel that the sector has already been taxed, but I would just like to add something to what Vijay just said. If you look at the speech, and it says that the levy shall be on all financial institutions, and if you look at the central bank annual report on a covered definition of financial institutions, they not only cover the banks as well as the non-banking financial institutions.
And also dialogue.
No, yes, sir. But in addition to dialogue, they also have 2 other very important categories: contractual savings institutes like EPF and ETF, as well as the primary dealers and stockbrokers. Those 2 segments account for as much as 23% of the total groupings of what we call financial institutions. So it will be interesting to see whether the contractual savings institutions are also going to be subjected to this levy.
And also the most important factor is the minister has said that he would give a tax credit to financial institutions, and if he is going to give tax credit, then it doesn't improve the revenue base of the government, because you collect it in the form of an indirect tax, and when the banks are paying, banks and other financial institutions are paying the direct tax on their profits, that is deducted. So there is no net improvement in the government revenue as a result of
I think what he has mentioned is a deduction from, it will qualify as a deduction for income tax, not a credit.
Yeah.
From your arriving at your taxable profit, you can deduct this levy as an expense.
But I think it has a
So it has a 28% impact.
Yeah. Another connotation is that the medium-term vision, I believe, is to have a mix between directs and indirect at 40-60.
Exactly. Yeah.
That ratio is today at 18-72, and if this is implemented and the levy is a charge on banks,
we are going in the other direction.
In the other direction.
Yeah.
Right.
So those are the basic issues, Charita, and therefore I don't think this is a tax which economists would approve of.
Economists would approve. I think we should ask Shiran a question. Just following up with what Dr. Vijayawardena said, you are the chief economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Is it something that you would approve?
Well, if you look at the levy as a whole, it's looking to get 22 billion. That translates to 130 million US dollars. And if you look at that in context of what we need to pay over the next 3 years, which is on average 3.6 billion, it's pale in comparison. So it doesn't solve the problem. It's not a levy that's going to change the game. You'd rather cut down on expenditure than go on these taxes. So I'd have to agree with my fellow panelists on this, because it doesn't serve the purpose of what it's intended to at the end of the day.
What he says is it's too short.
It's too short.
Too short, yes.
Although I'm not advocating for it to be higher, it doesn't.
Mr. Tyagaraja, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce welcomed Budget 2018, but also said the government needs to focus more on implementation of it. Now we know that there's a mechanism already in place. We also know that over 50% of last year's budget proposals, we don't know what has happened to it, right? So how confident are you that this government takes these proposals serious?
So I think, in fairness, we will give the benefit of doubt to the new minister to put in place the mechanism. And from what we hear over the last couple of days, they have appointed 2 equally eminent professionals to the monitoring mechanism, and certainly the Ceylon Chamber will play its part in extending its hand to the monitoring authority to do it. But my only request is that we don't do this post 12 months, that this should be done, if not monthly, at least on a quarterly basis. The data should also be made available on public domain for discussion and deliberation, and at the end of the day accountability has to be pinned. So I think that's very, very important to give, as you said, the confidence to the ordinary common citizen that there is execution or implementation.
Shiran, one more question on the same thought. We know that a study done by Verite Research found out that information to measure the progress of budget proposals was not online on ministry websites, and it was really difficult to get it from public officials. So what can the Chamber of Commerce do to, sort this out?
So if this unit actually does get operationalized, as a chamber, we could always open up that consultative action with the unit to sort of get their views, what's going on, even on a quarterly basis. And of course, resort to getting the right to information request going as well. That's what I think Verite also did in this fact-finding mission on the expenditure proposal. It was not on all proposals. So even on the revenue proposals, I think that's where probably the chamber will have even a greater input because of the impacts that will have on the sectors, the levies that we're talking about. But on the expenditure proposals, yes, it'll be difficult to track all of it, but at least some of the ones that are aligned to Vision 2025 and what the PM speech is also talking about, the chamber can play a bigger role in tracking them.
Mr. Hulangamu, the finance minister last week said, and I quote, "The budget will reawaken the entrepreneurial spirit coming from our ancient forefathers, enabling Sri Lanka to be a vibrant trading hub and encouraging all Sri Lankans to become co-owners of a country enriched." A beautiful rhetoric, very positive, a bold assertion. Now, if we juxtapose this with the ground realities, we have a country which has delayed local government elections, lack of readiness to deal with crises, inability to deal with issues at hand, no concerted effort, allegations of bribery and corruption, white-collar crime. So if we juxtapose these two, how practical do you think is the achievability of all the promises and undertakings that have been made in Budget 2018?
Yeah. See, I look at everything in a relative sense. In absolute terms, what you're saying is right, but I think if I read the budget proposals or budget speeches of successive finance ministers for the last 25 years, you'll find statements of this nature. So, these are all wishes made by governments with regard to what they want to in terms of economic development, social development. The most finance ministers, when they cover the budget, they talk of socio-economic development. It's an inclusive development, that is not only a certain class should develop, everyone should develop. So I think what the Honourable Minister mentioned was that the economy should be something that involves everyone, from small to medium to large scale, export to agriculture to environment. So it should incorporate everyone, and then only the country will develop and it will be sustainable. Now, as I told you, in relative, absolutely, I don't think we can achieve everything what he says, to be fair by him and by his predecessors. But I think we should look at it in a relative concept and see how much we have achieved and how much we can achieve. Now, if you take, for example, in terms of the reforms proposed for economic development. Now, the land ownership law has been a bottleneck for a long time for foreign ownership to participate in development projects in the country. So they have started the first step by saying we will liberalize ownership of land law for public quoted companies. Number two, the underperforming companies that were taken over about 4 years ago, that also was very draconian in terms of its legislation. Companies was taken over on the basis they are underperforming. The minister said that law he will remove, he will abolish at least going forward. So there is no fear of anyone taking over your business for the following day. If you take the reform suggested for the customs ordinance, reform suggested for agricultural property. So there is a lot of barriers which he has said he will remove for development, for entrepreneurship to be there. Then also I think we have been talking a lot about this debt recovery levy or debt repayment levy. But on the other hand, if you look at, there are a lot of concessions the government has given on para tariffs, which we didn't discuss all this time. There are about 1,200 items identified to be at least gazetted para tariffs of port and airport levy, and the NBT will be removed or reduced. That will provide the opportunity for most machinery, industrial machinery, to come free of those taxes. So that's no upfront cost of taxation. It release cash for investment. To certain intermediary goods that were subject to PAL and NBT, other than exports, will now come without those taxes. Then of course, if you take for example the hotel industry today is suffering a lot because most of their raw material inputs have to be imported. Their meat products, their cheeses, their, I mean, it might sound luxurious, but the hotel industry has to cater to the foreigners who come here. Those are subject to heavy taxes. So there is a lot of relief given by removing taxes on those items, so that the industry can then invest more on, give a cheaper product to the more competitive product to their clients. So I think, yes, there is a debt recovery levy or whatever repayment. But on the other hand, there is a lot of relaxation done on para tariffs, on customs duties. For example, the motor trade has been now rationalized. A lot of under-invoicing taking place in the motor trade. Now there is a very straightforward tax that has been based on cubic meter. So I think in the context of what he has said, definitely I think in a relative sense, the policy statements will go in the direction. And at least the taxation ones, we can always measure. The social ones are difficult to measure.
Shamin, you spoke about implementation. Now, this is one of the key areas that the government has been lacking over the last 3 years or so. 2018, in terms of implementation, is it easy or difficult to implement? Now, we're talking about an election in January. We're talking about supposedly a referendum in the coming 3 years or so. Do you think all this is possible?
Well, at least it's easy to track now. We know who is responsible and how far they will be down, a few months down the line. As to whether they are achievable, I mean, it depends on a lot of factors. It also depends on the responsiveness of the public to some of these reforms, which the government will bring, for example, in education sector. If there are, constant social and political barriers for these reforms, then of course the government will hit a roadblock. So, in as much as it is the government's responsibility to implement them, there is also a responsibility placed on the public to accept those proposals and take it forward, or help the government in taking it forward, rather than just sitting like this, like all of us, and criticizing it.
But Shamin, many a times the people have been paying these taxes. They've probably gone on the roads, protested, but every single time the government in power has won the battle. There has always been taxes. We saw this coming through the VAT, which came through a few months ago. 15%, that was not bearable at that time, but the people did pay. So you cannot blame the people. It's the government that has to be blamed, isn't it?
No, so there are two things. I mean, the taxes the government has to impose, and we, yes, the consumer will have to pay for it. But how those taxes are used and how well they are used, that the responsibility lies both with the government and also the general public to evaluate it on a regular basis, come forward with proposals, and be maybe vociferous of any deviations, instead of waiting till the end of the next year and then say, okay, items 1, 2, 3 and 4 have not been achieved. So in that sense, that's why I said that the setting up of the monitoring committee is a step forward in the right direction.
Dr. Wijewardena, I have a question about good governance and the budget 2018. I see there to be a mismatch. I'll tell you why. Now, the President's expenditure in the year 2016 stood at just over 2 billion. 2017, 6.4 billion. 2018, 9.9 billion. And this was a government that was elected to power, and the president himself said, I am going to curtail my expenses. Budget 2018, is it a really reflection of good governance? Because we see an increase in expenditure in the Prime Minister's budget as well.
Yeah, in that sense, of course, you know, there is a failure in good governance because the people who have the ability to decide on the level of expenditure that they can incur have appropriated the entirety of the expenditure for themselves, and they have to be controlled through the civil society action and not through any other thing, because the parliament, they have the power in parliament to get them approved, and as a result whatever the expenditure that they might say that they want would be approved by the members of parliament.
Dr. Wijewardena, there's been a troubling pattern when it comes to this government. It may be because of the nature of the coalition itself, the whole SLFP, UNP sort of hodgepodge that you've got going on. But the government has been quick, or has more often than not caved into political and social pressures. We saw this recently with the whole SITEM issue. We saw it with the issues surrounding the permits. Doctors went on strike, government caved, gave permits not only to the doctors but also to the MPs and the ministers and everyone else who wanted permits. So there's been this sort of pattern. Do you see a lot of these budget proposals being amended before we reach the vote on the
Yes, some of the things might get amended because the levy on the financial transactions, probably the entire banking sector, finance sector would oppose to the transaction, and eventually government will have to either amend it or take it out completely, because that kind of proposals, there is a possibility of being withdrawn.
Shiran, on that note, I'd like to come to you. Are you a fan of Star Trek?
No.
You would have heard the finance minister say at the NY Budget Forum that, you know, he was inspired by Star Trek Enterprise, which is one of his favorite shows growing up. I was more partial towards Star Wars, but I get the appeal of Star Trek as well. Good, solid science fiction. The Enterprise, which inspired Enterprise Sri Lanka, if you count off-screen and on-screen, it's been destroyed about 30 times. Do you fear that, given the pattern of the government caving into political pressures, do you fear that the same fate that befell the Enterprise no fewer than 30 occasions will befall this budget as well?
I think they'll give it a good try. Try to kickstart the whole enterprise. I think it's beyond 2018 that this whole enterprise concept is there for. It sort of, I think, ties in the 2025 goals that they're sort of trying to aiming for with the near-term 2020 elections or whatnot that you'll have in 3 years' time. So the enterprise is more, I would say, beyond 2020. But if you see it sort of not working out in 2018, then we might see it a bit caving in, but I think they'll give it a good try.
Mr. Tyagaraja, it's an ambitious budget. There's a lot of ambition in terms of achieving blue-green status. You want to get off fossil fuel powered vehicles by 2040. The government wants to get off fossil fuel powered vehicles by 2025. These ambitions need to be tempered with realism when it comes to governance. Do you see that element of realism from a banker's perspective? Do you see an element of realism and pragmatism in what can be achieved, considering the political and social challenges as well?
Being the eternal optimist, having come back to Sri Lanka in '92 when a country was going through a complete different set of challenges, I'm always willing to give the benefit of doubt. And I think in this particular space of the renewable energy and that particular space, while the government is setting a vision and a policy framework, we are also mindful of some parts of the private sector which is already gearing itself to participate in the distribution process of this. For example, electric charging points, right? And I think there is a while the private sector from an enterprise point of view is doing that, I think there is even a further opportunity for citizens Sri Lanka throughout the country to also participate in that progress, because with solar and with electric EV opportunities are coming in, the distribution can even be extended to the last mile, even at the village level, where you make each home, if they wish to, have the charging and distribution also as a revenue earning supplement to them. So I think the opportunity has been set, and it's up to the citizen.
But on that note though, shifting away from fossil, I mean, you need to have an energy source. So you're going to be putting a lot of faith in the CEB, also on private sector power, or even household power supplies through turning households into solar power plants essentially. But a couple of weeks ago we had the Director General of the Public Utilities Commission on Face the Nation, and he was telling us that there is resistance from the CEB to implement the approved generation plan. So that's another instance of where the government has been unable to take a firm stand.
So I think from a capacity...
So in that sort of a situation where where the government is unable to get its own electricity board to move ahead with the generation plan approved by the regulator, isn't this all on a house of cards essentially?
So I think from that perspective, if we look beyond the electricity, I think there is an opportunity to look at is there a justification for an overall independent regulator of energy, more than just electricity. And I think that conversation merits discussion, and I know even within Ceylon Chamber, the Chamber has reactivated its energy steering committee to give a lot of focus in the coming months in this particular space.
Thank you very much, gentlemen and the lady, for your thoughts in the first and second round. We go in for a quick commercial break. The good, the bad and the worst, where do we stand? All this and more after a short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back.